The envelope under the cake stand my granddaughter's 5th birthday party was held in her parents' backyard, under a string of paper lanterns her mother had spent a week choosing. I arrived with a wrapped gift, a bakery box of the lemon cookies Lily always asked for, and exactly one hope in my chest: that today, for once, nobody would find a reason to make me feel like a guest in my own family. Courtney met me at the side gate before I'd even made it to the yard. "Margaret," she said, warm in the specific way she was always warm when she wanted something to go smoothly. "We actually think it's better if you don't come in today. The family's still working through some things, and Peter thought it would be less confusing for Lily." I stood there with a bakery box going soft in my hands. 41 years of being Thomas's wife, 6 years of being this child's grandmother, and she delivered it like she was rescheduling a dentist appointment. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to speak to my son directly, though I could see him through the fence, crouched beside a bounce house, pretending not to notice I was standing at the gate. "That's all right," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "Tell Lily I said happy birthday, and tell Peter I'll see everyone Thursday at the reading." Courtney's smile faltered, just slightly. "The reading? He'll know what I mean," I said. Then I turned, walked back to my car, and set the bakery box on the passenger seat, and I drove home without a single tear, because I had cried plenty already, over the last year, in private, where it belonged. What Courtney didn't know, what my own son didn't fully understand yet, was that I had spent the last 14 months quietly assembling something none of them saw coming. Not out of spite, out of necessity. Because sometimes the people who love you the most get moved so slowly out of position that they don't even notice it happening to someone else. This isn't really a story about a birthday party. It's a story about a Thursday afternoon, a folder, and the exact moment a woman everyone had quietly decided to stop listening to finally made herself impossible to ignore. My name is Margaret. Before I tell you about Thursday, you should understand who I was before any of this. I met my husband, Thomas, when I was 26, working behind the counter of a small jewelry repair shop his father had owned for 30 years. Thomas had just come back from design school, full of ideas his father didn't entirely trust yet, and he used to stay late every evening sketching pieces at the workbench closest to mine. We married 2 years later, and together we spent the next 4 decades building that small repair counter into Ellery & Sons, a boutique jewelry house with 3 storefronts and a private design studio that supplied custom pieces to clients across the region. I wasn't simply Thomas's wife in that business. I was his partner in every meaningful sense. I managed the studio's client relationships for 38 years, developed half the signature collections myself, and knew every account, every vendor, every quiet arrangement that kept the company running long before either of us ever discussed retirement. Nobody outside the business fully understood how much of Ellery & Sons had actually been built by both of us, together, because Thomas never once corrected anyone who assumed otherwise, and neither did I. It never seemed to matter until it did. Our son, Peter, grew up assuming the business would simply be his one day, the way children often assume inevitabilities without examining them closely. He was a sweet, agreeable boy, and he grew into a sweet, agreeable man, the kind who wanted harmony more than he wanted to be right, which made him easy to love and, I would eventually learn, easy to steer. Thomas got sick 2 years before he passed. It moved slowly at first, then quickly, the way these things often do once they've decided which direction they're heading. In his final year, once the daily operations of the studio had settled comfortably into the hands of managers he trusted, Thomas spent several long afternoons with our attorney, Mr. Castellano, restructuring exactly how Ellery & Sons would be controlled once he was gone. "Margaret," he told me one evening, holding my hand in the hospital bed that had, by then, mostly replaced our own, "I've put the company shares into a trust. You hold them fully as trustee. Not because I doubt Peter, because I've watched him make decisions under pressure before, and I know how easily he bends toward whoever is standing closest to him. I need someone who won't bend to hold this until he's proven he can stand on his own." I told him I would, 3 weeks after Thomas passed. I sat in Mr. Castellano's office and learned exactly what that promise required of me. Full trusteeship over 72% of Ellery & Sons shares, along with the studio building itself, and a modest private account Thomas had built quietly over the last decade for Lily's education, to be released to Peter only once I determined, in my own judgment, that the company and its future were in steady hands. I told no one the details. I kept coming into the studio twice a week, the way I always had. I kept living in the same small house Thomas and I had bought 30 years earlier, and I waited exactly the way he'd asked me to. Courtney came into Peter's life about 7 months after Thomas passed. She was warm at first meetings, attentive in a way that felt, at the beginning, genuinely kind. She asked me thoughtful questions about the studio's history at our first real dinner together, and for a while, I believed we might actually understand one another. It didn't take long to notice what she never asked about. She never once inquired about Thomas. Not his design philosophy. Not what it took to build 3 stores from a single repair counter. Not even simple facts like how long we'd been married. She asked instead, gently, persistently, about the studio's ownership structure. Whether shares had ever been formally divided. Whether there were other family members with a claim. Whether, now that Thomas was gone, it might make sense to simplify things for Peter's sake. She wasn't asking out of curiosity about our family's history. She was assessing what stood between her and something else entirely. Peter began changing gradually after they married. He'd always been the kind of son who preferred agreement to friction, and slowly, that instinct redirected itself toward Courtney instead of toward me. Decisions he used to run past me first started arriving secondhand, wrapped in her language. Courtney thinks the studio should modernize faster. Courtney feels like you've been holding on to control longer than Dad intended. Courtney mentioned that maybe it's time for someone with fresh eyes to take the lead. I watched it happen slowly enough that no single visit looked alarming on its own, until an entire year had passed and I realized how far the distance between us had grown. The moment I understood the shape of things clearly came about 10 months after Thomas's death, when Peter asked to meet me for lunch and told me carefully that he and Courtney had been in discussions with an investment group interested in acquiring Ellery & Sons outright. He said it gently, the way people deliver things they've rehearsed. He mentioned that Courtney had actually introduced him to the buyer, through a business contact of hers, and that the offer, on paper, looked generous. I asked him plainly whether this was something he wanted, or something Courtney had led him toward. He didn't answer right away. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I told him I would need time to review any offer properly, as trustee, and that was true. But that lunch was the moment I stopped simply waiting and started paying very close attention. I called Mr. Castellano the next morning. He connected me with a forensic accountant named Renata Cho, a precise, unhurried woman who reviewed serious financial concerns in exactly the same calm tone she used to order her coffee. Alongside her formal work, I did some quiet research of my own, the kind that requires nothing but patience and a willingness to read documents. Nobody expects a grieving widow to actually read closely. What emerged over the following weeks reached further back than I expected. The investment group interested in acquiring Ellery & Sons called itself Solmara Ventures. On paper, it looked like a modest regional buyer with a reasonable, if slightly underwhelming, offer. Renata's research told a different story. Solmara Ventures had been registered only 14 months earlier. Its listed address a shared office suite 2 counties over. Its managing partner, a man named Gregory Volkov, had a history. A prior venture that had acquired 2 family-owned businesses in another state at below-market valuations, only for both companies to be quietly sold off in pieces within 18 months, at a considerable profit to Solmara and a considerable loss to the families who'd sold. The connection I hadn't expected came next. Corporate filings from 3 years earlier showed Courtney listed as a co-founder of an entity that later merged into Solmara Ventures, under a maiden name she had stopped using since marrying Peter. She wasn't simply introducing Peter to a buyer, she had a direct financial stake in the very acquisition she'd been quietly steering him toward. There was more. Renata's review of the studio's own recent records turned up a consulting retainer, paid over the last 8 months to a firm called Ashcombe Advisory, for market positioning services nobody at the studio could describe in any concrete terms. Ashcombe Advisory, once traced, turned out to share its registered agent with Solmara Ventures. Money had been quietly moving out of the company Peter would eventually inherit into an entity connected to the very people angling to buy that company for less than it was worth. There was also a recorded conversation made with Peter's full knowledge that I was keeping notes for my own records, in which he described the proposed sale price in terms that didn't match the studio's actual valuation. Numbers, Mr. Castellano later confirmed, that mattered a great deal to what was unfolding. By the week of Lily's birthday party, I had a folder, several corporate filings, and a conversation with Mr. Castellano that ended with him telling me plainly, "Margaret, you have more than enough here to stop this cleanly, and to make sure everyone understands exactly why." I didn't confront anyone at that birthday party. I stood at a gate, absorbed one more small, deniable dismissal, and said one calm sentence about Thursday. That was enough. Thursday, Mr. Castellano's office held Peter, Courtney, and a representative from Solmara Ventures who had been invited, at Peter's request, to finalize terms. I arrived with Renata's full report and a folder that had taken 14 months to build. Mr. Castellano began plainly. "Before we discuss any sale terms, there are some matters the trust requires us to address." Courtney's posture straightened, the way it always did when a room shifted in a direction she hadn't planned for. "As trustee," Mr. Castellano continued, "Margaret has reviewed the proposed transaction and has significant concerns regarding the independence of the buyer." He slid a folder across the table. "Solmara Ventures shares a registered agent with a consulting firm that has been paid over the last 8 months for services this company cannot substantiate. That consulting firm's registration traces to a corporate entity co-founded 3 years ago by Courtney under her maiden name." The room went very still. That has to be a coincidence," Courtney said, though her voice had lost the smooth, practiced warmth it usually carried. "There's also this," Mr. Castellano said, placing a second document on the table. A summary of 2 prior acquisitions by Solmara's managing partner, both involving family-owned businesses sold under similar circumstances, both later broken apart for profit within 18 months of the sale. Peter stared at the pages without picking them up. "Courtney," he said quietly, "is this true?" She didn't answer right away, which by now I understood was always the real answer. "I think," Mr. Castellano said gently, "we should pause this meeting." I learned what happened after that pause, because Peter told me himself 4 nights later, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, in the house he hadn't properly visited in over a year. He said Courtney's name several times before he managed a complete sentence. He told me that once the meeting broke, he'd asked her directly in the parking lot whether she'd known about the connection to Solmara from the beginning. She hadn't denied it. She'd told him calmly that she'd simply been looking out for their future, that the studio was more work than it was worth holding on to, that everything she'd done had been meant to benefit both of them. He told me he'd stood in that parking lot and, for the first time in 3 years, hadn't recognized a single thing about the way she was looking at him. "I don't even know who she really was this whole time," he said, and I reached across the table and put my hand over his, the way I used to when he was small and certain the dark held something worse than it did. "I know," I told him. "That's part of why I had to find out." We sat at that table until well past midnight. He told me everything. The way every disagreement he'd had with me over the past year had somehow started sounding like something Courtney had suggested first. The quiet, patient redirection that never once felt like pressure while it was happening. It felt, he said, like finally seeing things clearly. He hadn't been seeing anything clearly at all. I had. I take no satisfaction in what happened to that marriage. What I do take satisfaction in is this. Peter started coming by the studio every week after that, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to learn the parts of the business he'd never bothered learning before. Lily's birthday parties from that year forward never once had a side gate I wasn't welcome through. Courtney's attempt to challenge the trust, once her attorney reviewed Renata's documentation alongside the history of her prior corporate entanglements, was withdrawn before it ever reached a formal hearing. She and Peter separated within the year. Solmara Ventures' offer was withdrawn entirely once its connections became a matter of record, and Ellery & Sons stayed exactly where it belonged. Once Peter had spent the following year genuinely learning the business, the vendors, the client relationships, the quiet decisions that keep a company like ours actually running, I transferred the shares to him, precisely as Thomas had asked me to determine, in my own time, on my own judgment. One evening, not long after the transfer was finalized, Peter came by the house and asked me something I hadn't expected. Dad talked to Mr. Castellano about all of this before he got too sick to explain it himself, he said. Did he ever leave anything for me? Something that says why he set it up this way? I had, in fact, kept a letter Thomas asked me to hold until the right moment. I retrieved it from the drawer where it had rested for over a year and handed it to him. He read it in silence. When he looked up, his eyes were full. Thomas had written, "If you're reading this, Peter, it means your mother did exactly what I asked of her. Held steady when it would have been far easier not to. Protected something you weren't quite ready to protect yourself yet. She built as much of this business as I did, whether anyone outside our house ever understood that or not. If she made a decision about any of it, trust that it was the right one. Don't make her wait as long as I did to hear that." Peter folded the letter carefully and sat with it for a long while. Then he said, "I won't. I'm not telling you this story to make myself into anyone's hero. I made my own mistakes along the way. A year of staying quiet at gates and dinner tables when a smaller, earlier word might have spared all of us some of this. Moments I mistook patience for the only option, when it was really just the most familiar one. But here's what I've come to understand, watching it all unfold. The people who stay quiet in a room are very often the ones who see it most clearly. Not because they're detached, but because they were never performing for anyone in the first place. They're paying attention. They're building something patient and real in the exact places louder people never think to look. Courtney underestimated me because I never raised my voice, never made a scene, never argued at a gate I'd been quietly turned away from. She looked at my stillness and mistook it for something she could simply walk past. She saw the wrong thing entirely. If you've ever been the person quietly moved to the edges of your own family, I'm not here to tell you exactly what to do about it. Every family carries its own particular weight, but I'll tell you this. Don't spend your energy convincing people of what you're worth. Spend it documenting it, protecting it, building quietly while everyone around you assumes you've already stepped aside. The truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it just needs to arrive in a folder, on a Thursday, exactly when it matters most. And here's the question I want to leave you with today. How many people in your life have decided who you are without ever actually looking closely enough to find out? And what would it take for them to finally see it? Sit with that for a moment. And if any part of this story felt familiar, share it with someone who might need it today. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next one.